Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look and see what we're going to be covering in Rewst 105. Let's go ahead and get started. And as always, thank you for watching. Up to this point, we've been managing our groups using Microsoft Graph. As we know, there are different types of groups, and based on the type of group, we're either going to be needing to use Microsoft Graph or Microsoft Exchange Online. We're going to implement the logic to differentiate between those different group types so that we can implement the proper actions to modify the groups. Once we have that taken care of, we'll also implement the framework or the backbone of the messages that we're going to be sending to the person filling out the form. We'll also take a look and see how to handle when a task fails within our workflow to ensure that our workflow still runs appropriately. So behind the scenes, what we'll need to do is determine the group type. The way we do that is using the group type attribute or property. Once we're able to access the value of the group type property, we'll be able to determine whether to use Microsoft Graph or Exchange Online. After we've implemented that logic, we'll also implement strings as the backbone of providing feedback messages when our task succeeds and our task fails. Let's talk about group types. So when we are dealing with group types that are unified, we can manage those using Graph. When we're dealing with security groups, we need to first determine whether mail enabled is set to true or false. If it is mail enabled, we can manage those using Exchange Online. If it is not, those groups will be managed by Microsoft Graph. When we're dealing with distribution groups, we'll also be needing to use Exchange Online, and we also need to factor in dynamic membership groups that cannot be managed by API calls. So we'll be needing to figure out what type of group we have based off of these conditions. What we'll be doing in our exercise is implementing this type of logic using a no-op. We'll be checking the group types attribute and seeing what's contained inside of it. Based off of what's contained and whether mail enabled is true or false will help us determine whether to use Microsoft Graph or Exchange Online. So as an overview, we're going to determine what type of group is selected. We'll implement Exchange Online to handle the groups that can only be managed by Exchange Online. And then we're also going to be implementing feedback messages for our tasks that fail or succeed. Let's go ahead and jump into our exercises. We're back over here at the workflow that we've been working on. Make sure you've completed Rewst 102 and Rewst 104 before proceeding with the following steps. The first thing we're going to need to do is get the group object. Right now, the only thing we know about the group is the group ID. We're going to get the group object so we can access the mail enabled property and the group types property. Let's go ahead and see how to do that. We're going to head over to the actions on the left-hand side, and we're going to search graph. Under the graph section, we're going to look specifically for get group. Once you've found get group, you can drag and drop it onto the workflow editor. I'm going to line things up and then give this a little bit of a simpler name. We're going to need to input the group ID as a parameter. We know the group ID is the context variable ctx.groupid. So I'll go ahead and input that in my editor, ctx.groupid, like so. And then we'll close this out. From here, in order to more easily access the result of this action, we're going to create a data alias. So in the transition, I'm going to create a data alias. We're going to give this data alias a name, and we'll call it group. The value of the data alias or variable is going to be the result of this get group action. To get the result of the action, we're going to follow the pattern result data.value like so. So this is an important pattern that we use within Rewst, so keep this in mind. This pattern is used to get the result that we are currently focusing in on, in this case, get group. I'll go ahead and close this out, and we now have the group object stored in the group variable under the data aliases. Now that we have the group object, we now have the ability to access the properties of that group. Let's go ahead and see how we can implement some logic to determine what kind of group we'll be managing. I'm going to add a no-op right in between our get group and our add and remove. Right-clicking and then select the no op. These are again my favorite options. So this is how I'm able to access it using the right click. After adding the no op, I'm going to give this a name, and we'll call this check group type, like so. I'll zoom out a little bit and then give myself a little bit of space. We're going to use a number of transitions to check for the various attributes of the group to determine what type of group it is. So for the first transition, I'm going to be checking for dynamic membership groups. So I'll give this a custom label of dynamic group. And then for the custom condition, we'll launch our editor, and a dynamic membership group will have dynamic membership in its group type. So I'm going to search specifically for dynamic membership, and then we're going to see if that's in group type. So the group type is found in the group object that we created. We stored the group object in the variable group, and then we're honing in on the property called group types. So we're checking to see if dynamic membership is in the group types property of the group context variable. We'll go ahead and close this out. And then we're going to have another transition. The next transition, we're going to be accounting for groups that we can manage using graph. So clicking on the new transition, I'm going to call this graph. And then we're going to select custom condition and then launch our editor. 2 curly brackets. And then in group types, we're going to be looking for unified, or we're going to be looking to see that mail enabled is false. In our case, the way that we can express whether or not mail enabled is true or false is using not. So let's start with unified first. So we're going to be looking for unified in that group types property of our group variable. So ctx.group.grouptypes. So that's one situation where we can use Microsoft Graph. And again, the other one is when mail enabled is set to false. So where we're saying not ctx.group and then the property mail enabled. So when it's set to false, in this case, we're expressing that as not mail enabled. Once we have that all squared away, let's go ahead and close the editor. We're going to need one more transition. And this is going to be covering groups that are managed by Exchange Online. So I'm going to select the transition and then give this the label EXO, like so. In this case, we're going to account for the other situations first, and then if those two situations are not applicable, we're going to use this transition to bring us to the logic for Exchange Online. So if it is not a dynamic group, if it is not managed by Graph, then by default we will say it is managed by Exchange Online. Let's go ahead and connect some dots here, connect some of our transitions. This one comes over here to Graph. And the next thing I'm going to ensure that we do is make sure that in the no-op for check group type, we're going to go into advanced, and then we're going to use follow first. We're going to be implementing the condition that first matches. Whatever matches first, we will follow that transition. The next thing we're going to do is implement the logic for Exchange Online. We're going to take a shortcut here, and then we're first going to copy the no-op for add or remove. We know that adding and removing is going to be coming from the ctx.action variable, so the logic to add or remove is going to be the same. So I'll go ahead and create a copy of this no-op, move it over to the right, and I'll rename our original no-op graph, and then I'll name the new no-op Exchange Online or just EXO. And then we'll take the transition for EXO and connect it over to our add or remove EXO no-op. Now that we have that taken care of, we're going to be implementing the add and remove logic for Exchange Online. I'm going to head over to the search bar and I'm going to type Exchange. You'll see Microsoft Exchange Online, and the only action that we have is invoke command. Using Exchange Online commands is just going to be using commandlets. so long as we know the name of the commandlet and the parameters that the commandlet needs. That's all we're going to need to use Microsoft Exchange Online commands. Let's go ahead and see how this works. I'm going to bring invoke command. I'm going to give this a new name. We're going to simplify the name, something like EXO add group member, something like this. I'll connect the add over to the new action, and then we're going to click into the action. We're going to need to input the commandlet name. If you look through documentation, you're going to find that the commandlet that's used is called add-distribution group member. So I'll go ahead and type that out. And then in this commandlet, we're going to need 3 parameters. So I'll go ahead and click the plus button 3 times. The first parameter is going to be the member, which is the user that we're going to be adding. So we know the user is going to be retrieved using that user ID. So ctx.user_id, and then we'll close this out. Next is going to be identity. Identity is the group, and we are going to get the group using the group ID, group_ID. And then we'll close this out. And then the last thing is going to be bypass security group manager check. So I'll go ahead and type that out. Security group manager check. And then the value of that is going to be true. We're going to follow the same motions for removing the group member. The only difference between what we did here and what we're going to do in remove is just the commandlet name. So rather than having to type all of these things out again, we're going to head over to the options button, and then we're going to create a copy of the action that we've just created or implemented. We're going to create a copy of the action we just implemented. Give me a little bit of space here. I'll rename this action, and we'll call it EXO remove group member. I'll save that. We'll connect our transition, and then changing the name from add to remove. One thing I like to do along the way is just make sure to save the progress or the work we've done. So I'll go ahead and click publish and then submit, again, just to save along the way. Now that we have the logic implemented to add or remove different types of groups, the next thing we're going to be doing is building out the framework of sending feedback messages to the person filling out the form. We're going to first create an output variable, and then with each one of our actions, we're going to be implementing a data alias to contain a message based off of whether the action was successful or if it failed. Let's go ahead and start off by building out that output variable. We're going to go ahead and click on the pencil up here at the top right. I'm going to scroll down, and then we're going to click on the plus to add an output. We're going to give this output a name. I'll call it group_result. And in each one of our actions, we'll also have that. We're going to be setting the data alias to be the value of group result. So we're going to click on the editor, and then in each one of my actions, I'll create a data alias, and we'll call it effectively the same thing, ctx.group_result. We still need to create those variables, and that's what we're going to be doing next. Let's go ahead and click close, and then submit. Now that we've created the output variable, next I'm going to go into each one of my actions and create a data alias for when the action succeeds and when it fails. I'll do a couple, and then we'll use some edit magic to expedite the rest of them. So let's go ahead and start off with one of them. So we'll start off here on the on success, head over to data aliases, and then we're going to create a variable or a data alias. So the data alias for all of the actions is going to be group result. And then the value is going to be the message that we want to send back to our form filler. So we can say something like user was added to MS graph group. And then since we have the group object, we're able to access things like its display name. So ctx.group.displayName. And then we're going to pipe the result to the filter D to create a default value of an empty string to account for any sort of oddities if the display name is something like null or void. And then we'll go ahead and exit out. And then we're going to do the same thing for if the action fails. So I'll create another transition. We'll select it. And then I'm going to click on the condition for when it fails or on failure, and doing the same thing. We'll give the data alias the same name as group result. And then the value of group result is going to be the message that we want to output to our form filler. So we can say something like failed adding the user to graph group, and then specifying the display name, ctx.group, and then the display name, and then piping the results again to the defilter to account for those oddities as mentioned previously. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing for each one of our different actions. I'll use some edit magic, and all of a sudden, all done. Last thing we're going to do is add some finishing touches. We're going to add an error message on get group, and we're also going to add an error message on dynamic group. We'll also add one last thing to improve our error handling. Let's go ahead and take care of some of these things. We're going to start up here at get group. I'll add another transition, and then we're going to select the on failure condition. This is in case we're unable to get the group. I'm going to create a data alias, and following the same pattern, we're going to create an alias called group result, and then we're going to head over into our editor and then just provide some sort of message, something like failed to get group information for, and then the group we're trying to get. Since we don't have the group object yet, we can only reference the group ID. Since we don't have the group object yet, we can only reference the group ID. We'll go ahead and close this out. I'll add a message over here for dynamic group. We know that if a group is a dynamic membership group, we are unable to modify the group using any APIs. So creating a data alias or variable, and then providing a message letting us know what's going on. So something like the group, and then the name of the group. Passing the value over to our filter for the default value, and then saying it's a dynamic group. And cannot be directly modified. Something like this. And then we'll close this out. We've added a couple of additional error handling messages. The last thing we're going to do is improve the overall error handling of the workflow. We're going to go down towards the bottom of the workflow. I'll zoom out a couple clicks. And then we're going to add a no-op towards the bottom. I'll name this no-op finish. And then we're going to connect all of our actions to this no-op. We'll probably use some edit magic to speed this part up. And then we're going to select the no-op. We're going to select advanced, and then select task transition criteria sensitivity. And then from here, we'll go ahead and enter 1. By putting a no-op at the end of our workflow and connecting our actions to it, this allows us to control the way successes and failures are handled. By setting the task transition to 1 and having the actions connected to it, this allows us to control the success or failure of the workflow, or at least how it's expressed in Rewst. By setting it to 1, this is saying that so long as one parent task or a task that's connected to our no-op is successful, we can then say the whole workflow is successful. Since we have transitions for on success and on failure, we can say that the workflow is quote-unquote successful, even if technically the action does not complete as we expect it. I'll go ahead and publish the workflow. The last thing we need to do is test out the workflow. I'm going to head back over to the form that we created back in Rewst 102, modified it in Rewst 104. Once we're in the form, I'll go ahead and select a user to modify. We'll say CLUCK Norris. If you have a favorite Chuck Norris joke, feel free to leave that in the comments. I'll remove CLUCK Norris from a group. We'll say a distribution group. As the name suggests, this should be a distribution group. I'll navigate over to the results of my workflow and see how it goes. Looks like it is successful. Distribution groups are managed by Exchange, and we see that it follows the workflow and removes the user using our Exchange action. I hope you found this video useful and are able to use some of these concepts and features in your own instance of Rewst. I want to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.